Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Gaming Materialists. My name is Djene Badgelan, and I am here for This is Revolution and VarnVlog's monthly gaming and nerd culture podcast / YouTube show. And today we have an extremely exciting show about a topic that we've tackled on this show before: Vampire the Masquerade by White Wolf. We have talked about extensively, but today we're going to be talking about the step brother and or sister of Vampire the Masquerade, which is Vampire the Requiem, the edition that came out in the early 2000s to replace the original Vampire. In addition to that, I have exciting news, which I was hoping to keep a secret, but, Varn can't resist just tweeting everything. So if you follow Varn's tweets, you will know. We have a new crew member joining us today for the show, and hopefully who will be a regular on the show, part of the team. And I will introduce that new person right after I bring in the one, the only, the greatest Sean King impersonator in human history, C. Derek Varn. How you doing, C. Derek Varn?
Hello.
Ready to talk some Vampire today?
I am, and I'm going to be defending the honor of Vampire Requiem, but even more importantly, Chronicles of Darkness / New World of Darkness, depending on when you entered it.
I would have really liked to have seen you in a LARP dressed as a vampire in the early 2000s. I can totally picture that. I bet you were a very serious vampire player. You were like, no, we're not joking here. I am a Lord of Darkness.
No, I was not like that. But I did actually. I had a job running a LARP for about a year in 2000. Before I took my most infamous job, but I generally played a Cappadocian, so I would just dress like a monk who was very pale.
Oh, well, that's not a lot of effort there, Varn. Not impressed. Well, letting me bring on now our third co-host and member of the team. You can see her down in the bottom because her picture is there. It is the one, the only Discourse. Welcome, Discourse. Woo!
Hey. Hello.
Have you ever dressed up as a vampire?
Not to LARP, not to play World of Darkness or anything. Although I've always wanted to. I've always wanted to get into a LARP. Although I have heard some horror stories about World of Darkness, not the good kind either. Although I do own like a little book that is like it's like from the mid 2000s. That's all about like building like costumes, that stuff for like World of Dark. I think it was published by White Wolf at the time. It's got full of images and stuff. Found it in a charity shop. Picked that one up. Never been able to implement it.
Well, considering your YouTube channel and the artistic renditions and shorts that you do, your love of 90s style video game shorts, I think it's only a logical step for you to do a vampire LARP. I think you're very close to that territory.
It's gonna happen one day. It definitely is gonna happen one day. It's just a question of when, I guess.
the great vampire LARPs. Well, yeah, I think with the vampire LARPing, I don't know if any of you. I know, Varn, I think you saw it. There was a White Wolf documentary, which was more like a kind of hour-and-a-half infomercial, and
yeah,
they had
we watched it together for a show.
Yeah, we did. We watched it for a show, and the scenes they had with the LARPs, it was like, this is not what a LARP looks like, because they had like all the beautiful people, like the statuesque men and the sexy women, all like, it's like that's not what a LARP looks like. This is like and that kind of like respectful sexual tension, and that's also perhaps not what, you see, this is why vampire LARPing is a little creepy to me, because it's like, I don't know, it gets a little bit too, it seems like it would get a bit too touchy-feely for my liking. Spencer Leonard would probably call me a prudy conservative millennial, but you know, I don't want people getting up in my face, and I don't like other people's bodies, you know, whatever they look like, you know, that's
Just
why
generally.
that's why Dungeons and Dragons is a far more wholesome lot. Just beat people across the face with a plastic sword and be done with it.
I don't know. There's all sorts of problematic magic in Dungeons and Dragons as well.
Yeah.
Oh, don't. I watched LARPers in the park outside my house. You know, they seem pretty wholesome. You know, they you know.
From
What
afar.
kind of LARPers? The D&D kind or the vampire kind?
No, the D&D kind. There was a documentary called The Games Master or The Game Master, which is maybe like from 10, 15 years ago. I don't know if any of you ever saw that one, but it was about people who did live action role plays, and it was probably the most depressing documentary because, like, you know, you have all these people that are kind of like silly and a joke. You know, like there's a guy who thinks he's going to be a novelist, and he's like really arrogant. He's like one of those like really annoying players who's really arrogant, but then it turns out like that he can't keep down a job. His wife is like super depressed. He neglects his children, and he's having like big sight. It's like, dude, why did you just drop this ball? And then there's this woman who walks around dressed as a drow elf all the time with the whole makeup on. And she's like, it's like, yeah, when I was 16, you know, I got pregnant and ran away with like a 37-year-old, and he abused me. It's like, Jesus Christ, man! Like, why would you drop this stuff? This is so horrible. And also, kind of like, they, you know, kind of scintillation, but it really made me depressed about LARPing. But enough about my phobias and fears and my terror. We are talking about Vampire the Requiem. What the heck is Vampire the Requiem? Well, to people like me who played Vampire the Masquerade, it was a betrayal. It was a deep betrayal. I had all the books, the original White Wolf vampire universe, and then they blew it up. Literally,
Good
they blew it
riddance.
up.
Good riddance.
They issued a book called the Gehenna Book, which was the end of the world, and that was it. The end of World of Darkness. But soon, it was born again as Vampire the Requiem, which was a kind of reboot of White Wolf's world, and a reboot which I don't think gained the popular, you know, the popular the place in popular culture that Vampire the Masquerade had. But for some strange reason, it has many defenders, and I am speaking with two of them today. So, you know, before we get really into it, you know, I want to ask Discourse, you know, was Vampire the Requiem, like, how does that fit into your evolution as a role player? And you know, did you play the original Vampire, you know, or was this your introduction? Because you are a little bit younger than Varn and I in terms of so your gaming generation is somewhat different.
Yeah, so I think that I think this is the thing, right? Because Vampire the Requiem to me was always like the vampire game. It wasn't Vampire the Masquerade. I came in, I think, slightly later than you guys. I came in after the transition from Vampire the Masquerade over to Vampire the Requiem. And the thing is that whenever I started role playing, I started with Dark Heresy. Like I pretty much stayed away from Dungeons and Dragons for years. Like that was like a much later game I played. So I started with Dark Heresy, and then I got into World of Darkness from there. So and like Warhammer Fantasy and stuff like that. So the kind of darker TTRPGs were always the ones that I really enjoyed. That I got into World of Darkness alongside Call of Cthulhu as well. And the reason, so Vampire the Requiem to me was always like the vampire game. I was aware of Vampire the Masquerade, but Vampire the Masquerade, to be frank, you know, looking at it from someone who has played Vampire the Requiem, Vampire the Masquerade, it always felt like a very bloated, kind of strange experience. The kind of the storyline that they had going on, this running storyline, it seemed like the game had. Whereas to me, the strength of Vampire the Requiem was that it was a story. You basically, as the storyteller, the GM in the sort of World of Darkness parlance, you had complete control over the setting. It was explicitly designed so that you could control the setting and the story and the kind of environment that your players were within. Vampire the Masquerade felt like it was very prescriptive in comparison.
So you were aware of Vampire the Masquerade, but didn't have direct experience of it. But
From the video game, yeah, from the video game.
from Bloodlines, yeah. So
Yeah.
Bloodlines was quite an influential game at the time. So people are aware it was made by Troika, and it's
Mhm.
kind of viewed in retrospect as a classic. It's got DiMaggio, the guy who plays Bender in Futurama, does one of the voices, I think. So I mean, it was with multiple endings and things like that. So that's interesting that your experience with Masquerade came through the video games. So turning to you, Varn, what about what about you? You're an old hand at Vampire. Like when you ran your Vampire LARPs, you were running Masquerade LARPs, I assume.
Yeah, that was, well, we were running Vampire to Dark Ages LARPs, but so you still have some of your fun ridiculousness as regards to costumes, Gene. But yeah, I got into LARPing because, frankly, it was a fairly cheap hobby. The Mind's Eye Theater books were significantly cheaper than the gaming books, although I got them too eventually. And I also, when it actually happened, I felt betrayed, but not because of the game. I felt betrayed because people don't remember this about White Wolf. They were literally releasing like 6 books a month for a decade. Like, it was impossible to. So by the time they reset, and they were releasing new material, even new core bucks, up to the moment they reset, which was a fundamental mistake. By the time they reset, everyone was angry because they'd invested I don't know, thousands of dollars into a huge library of books. I think the other thing that we have to talk about in regards to LARP, yes, there are Vampire the Requiem LARP rules, but it's actually built for tabletop. That's what it's for. And one of the things about the LARP rules is that you had 2 massive organizations, one owned by White Wolf, one not, that ran these giant unified games that they would literally not just we're not just subject to the changes in anything that was published in the book. So this extremely massive and frankly incoherent canon that they had built, but also often were where they got some of the storylines. I mean, it's kind of an open secret that a lot of the metaplot was just stolen from some of these massive games, and these games were massive. I mean, the OWBN, which is the One World by Night, and the Camarilla, which was literally owned by White Wolf, had gaming chapters that would have people fly out from like Ireland or the Netherlands to the United States to play these games. So, the reason why you had sexy LARPers on that thing is because, well, there's so many people involved that you can find a few people who seem functional. And so this was a slap in the face to that too, right? When this happens, everything resets. There's an immediate, we've already talked about this. There was immediate legal rights struggle over the Camarilla because it's kind of ended by White Wolf. Somebody else tries to claim it. They end up suing their fan base, but the claim was one of the few times we're going to say, well, White Wolf was actually kind of in the right, because what the people were trying to do, they were trying to claim it and then sue all these other One World interlinked LARP games out of existence. So it's not a simple case of like the fans
versus the company.
Yeah.
It's the fans versus the company versus the fans.
So we know that dynamic.
Yep, we do.
So what you're saying is, so White Wolf you would say botched that transition
They,
through
yeah,
through bad business practices. I
totally.
can't. Is there another company that releases new books every month and then does a new edition that makes all those books suddenly? I wonder. I wonder what company might do that today.
I'll say this much about Games Workshop: at least they sort of survive the transition each time.
They do. They do survive the transition,
Yeah,
which is interesting.
they're kind of
It's
unique in
interesting.
that regard, actually, because it's destroyed. I mean, it destroyed TSR.
Yeah,
So,
it destroyed Dungeons and Dragons. It destroyed White Wolf. Games Workshop, and I suspect Games Workshop it survives it because it's not just books. There's like a tactile, like miniature investment, and the books are secondary. Whereas if you're dealing with something like a role play game, the book is your primary thing. So like, I mean, people aren't going to collect Games Workshop because they want to buy a Space Marine Codex.
And there's not as much of a physical investment in it either, right? Like you're not as invested in the hobby because you can just like play a different game. It doesn't. I mean, you forget about your characters anyway. You leave your characters whenever you're done with them most of the time, anyway.
But you can never leave your pile of shame. That's
can't
true.
leave your miniatures behind.
You can't leave never leave a miniature behind. So they botch this transition. They do a bunch of things, and then Requiem comes up, and there's a kind of reaction to the community. But like with many things, and I've spoken to both of you about this, like there is an improvement. I mean, like role play games from their inception don't come into the world like fully formed and perfect, right? And there's an extended period of game design in which we see many iterations of many games. I mean, like compare like original, I know there's a lot of nostalgia for original Dungeons and Dragons, but like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is so much more accessible to average people. What I think people often miss about the older games is like the kind of darker aesthetic and the kind of like harder world. But like in terms of game mechanics, we often deal with like a good evolution, unless it's 9th edition Warhammer. But you look like you have something you want to say about like the evolution of games mechanics. Discourse, go ahead.
Not necessarily mechanics, because I was just thinking, because I know there's lots and lots and lots of people. In fact, I would say it's probably more of the default position for most people that they prefer Vampire the Masquerade, and I sort of, and therefore they kind of prefer the old World of Darkness. White Wolf really screwed us over with the naming of this stuff. So it's the old World of Darkness, which is Vampire the Masquerade, and then that changes to Chronicles of Darkness or New World of Darkness with Vampire the Requiem, and now there's the new World of Darkness, which is Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, and New World of Darkness is now known as Chronicles of Darkness. Right.
Yeah.
So
how confusing.
Right. But for me, I always perceived Chronicles of Darkness as a very almost superhero-esque game where the sort of power levels were so absurdly strong. The metaplot had kind of destroyed. Like, to me, the sort of original Vampire the Masquerade doesn't feel like much of a horror game. And what I want, and the thing that I love about Vampire the Requiem and kind of the Chronicles of Darkness generally, is that it's very focused on horror and like the sort of, I think it's described often as personal horror in the books. I'm not sure how well it succeeds at that, but certainly the tone is one of horror generally. Whereas Vampire the Masquerade is like, I've played games of Vampire the Masquerade. It's you're usually kicking in doors of warehouses and fighting Nazis. That tends to be the stories that I've seen played out on the table.
So what do you think? What do you think makes Vampire the Masquerade seem like somewhat mundane compared to Vampire the Requiem? Is it a mechanical thing? Is it the metaplot thing? What do you think?
Metaplot.
What would you say the core difference then is in that metaplot? So I would say for people who don't know, in Vampire the Masquerade, it is by the early 2000s a really bloated metaplot, and if you like read all the books, it's like there's a ghoul, a vampire around like every corner. It's like, they're like fish and chip shops. It's like there's so many conspiracies, they become mundane. How does this differ in Requiem?
So Vampire the Requiem is different from World. There's no history. There's no kind of set in place. There's like a vague kind of history given in the book, you know, and suggestions for the storyteller of stuff they might want to incorporate. There's vampire bloodlines and clans, but they're much less certain. Everything's more amorphous. Everything's much more up to interpretation. And oftentimes it's kind of described as a city level game, you know,
Mm-hmm.
where any sort of things that are set in stone tend to be set in stone for that city. Conversely, Vampire the Masquerade is very much like, here is the history of vampires.
Mm-hmm.
All of vampires were made in 1301, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like very much set. And what that does is by giving players this almost encyclopedic knowledge of all of the monsters and everything that has happened in the world, it completely scrubs the history. And one of the things that horror, I think, really relies on is the unknown. It requires things to be uncertain. You need to be unsteady in the world. You need to be afraid of what you could turn around and find, because it could be anything. Vampire the Masquerade, to me at least, as someone who's played through the Giovanni Chronicles,
Mm-hmm.
it just feels like, you know, you kind of you turn around and it's a ghoul. Oh, I know what one of those are. It says all about them here. And another thing about the meta plot is that I sometimes think, and this happens with Warhammer 40K a lot as well, is that people often mistake a lot of content, a lot of lore as depth. And that, I don't
Right.
think that necessarily, you know, just because there's like massive books written about it doesn't mean that it's actually deep at all. And I don't think that the World of Darkness is.
I think that's a really important observation, especially with regard to like how we perceive fantasy and sci-fi lore, in the sense, like you say, like what expanding lore in official canon is. And just a plug to Sublation magazine here, we actually had an article in Sublation by Stefan Bertram Lee about fan fiction and is it legitimate. By canonizing like a setting, you are destroying the mystery of that setting to a certain degree. And at the same time, of course, why it is being canonized is pure economics. It's commercializing people's wonder. But every time you go to that fountain to try and make money off it, you diminish the awe and mystery.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And I will say though, there is something to be said for having like a big canon, like Varn was talking about earlier with the LARPs. I mean, that sounds fun. Being able to take part in games that actually, you know, impact on the sort of shared universe, and everybody has to agree now that that thing that happened in LA actually happened. That we all agree that that's the case, and now my future games are going to be played under the assumption that that occurred. Like, that's the really cool part about the meta plot. It's just that when you have something like that going on for like 10, 15 years, it just becomes convoluted. I don't know if there's any way, especially if you're letting players stuff interact with the world. It's hard not to get it convoluted.
Yeah, I think that one of the things you have to deal with that, and then I was just talking about Requiem, but is that not only does it become convoluted, the mechanics and the power sets were constantly evolving, but the meta plot was canon. So this actually led to like things happening in earlier forms of White Wolf that they would try to play test out, but they put it into the canon, and it is canon as this event happened this way. This, when they brought White Wolf back into new World of Darkness, which is really old World of Darkness, but not actually, because we ignore parts of it. What you see is this became a mess that's almost impossible to clean up. And one day we'll have to talk about Fifth Ed Vampire, because it's not a terrible product, but it's really hard to actually play, because it's even hard to know what is and isn't canon now. It's a problem. I think the other dynamic we have to talk about, though, this metaplot stuff also appeals to the kind of nerds that get into all kinds of fandoms. This is more of a fandom issue, and so you have the same problems. Requiem Requiem comes out, I actually think there is a mechanics element to this, because another issue that you've always had with the old World of Darkness is that the rule systems were not compatible. You actually start off as a superhero. There's no real way to start off as a human, because there is no actual shared mechanic between the games, which is crazy. But it was also it was part of the superhero problem that we're talking about. Like depending on what you brought into another game, if you use the rules as written for it in its core book, everything could insta slaughter everything else. But the rules weren't compatible either. So like if you're running a mage game, the mages are going to win. If you're running a vampire game, the mages are going to lose, even though it's ostensibly the same world. That's a problem. And then there's I think the third problem, which I think was a real problem for them. And when we talk about in the early 90s, a lot of these you got a lot of white dudes from the Midwest and the South trying to incorporate cultures to be progressive, and they really are trying to be progressive. But they're also coming out of the same idea of role playing as D&D, where there's ethno-essential traits and stats, and then you also mythicize it. They realized even by the late 90s that they needed to write themselves out of that, and in some cases, for example, I would actually say they end up being very interesting. Like we talked about it off air, the Assamites, which are
they were originally just like straight up assassin terrorist vampires, but then actually in the later editions they said, oh no, that's just the racist Western stereotype. They're actually a deeply cultured Middle Eastern. I think all the Romani Ravanos, the Romani ones, were
they just kind of killed to get rid of.
Frankly. No, they upgraded them. Originally, they were just like Romanis, but then it turned out the reason Romanis were Ravanos is because Ravanos were the ruling vampires of India. So they did kind of try and do those things. But it is, I think, both the lore and the mechanics are interesting. Like in Vampire the Masquerade, they evolve. Like it's like an ongoing iteration process. But then when you shut down and start a new edition, like it's like you can reset everything. So like Discourse, you made the point about the metaplot, and I think I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, I think when all your players kick down a door, someone does a funky power, and it's like, oh, that's like a 8th level Bruja using his light presence on us. It's like oh, it's just like there's no mystery to it. But by like having a Vega meta plot makes a lot of sense to me in the sense that you can still probably scare your players. And then of course the point Varn makes about the mechanics is also interesting, because that's a moment where you can take stock of like what's working and what's not working, because we see this in like all kinds of games. We see it in Warhammer. We see like just rule bloat. It's like inevitable things becoming like unbalanced, inevitable, and the fact that there's a tendency amongst nerd gamers to, like, because there's nothing stopping you from playing Vampire the Masquerade but changing all the lore. But for some reason, like, I don't know, why do you think people can't do that kind of role playing?
Well, I actually think there are things mechanically stopping you from doing that, because the generation thing in that version of the game is written into the game, and it doesn't make sense that much without the metaplot. There are other things that you have to deal with, like the power sets of the disciplines are high, and this is actually unique to Vampire, even in the White Wolf world, are highly rigidly prescribed, but occasionally aren't.
So how does it?
Yeah.
So I was going to ask Discourse, how does it work in Requiem? What how do vampires and powers work what makes it a better game in terms of mechanics?
So I mean, like, I'm gonna be honest here. Okay, so Vampire the Requiem isn't my favorite World of Darkness game.
Me either.
My favorite is Hunter the Reckoning. Is my favorite. I gotta say.
Is-
What's yours, Varn?
My favorite World of Darkness is Mage the Awakening, and then I also
Mage.
really like Changeling the Forgotten.
Isn't it
No, it's not
Changeling
the Dreaming. It's not the Dreaming.
Yeah. The Dreaming is the original one, right? See,
Yeah.
to me, they all get conflated in my head a lot.
So wait,
It's kind
Hunter.
of like-
What's the Hunter from World of the Vampire the Masquerade
Original.
world?
That's
Yeah.
Hunter the Vigil.
Hunter
the
the
No,
Vigil.
Flitch it. Actually, it's Hunter the Vigil is the new one, and Hunter the Reckoning is the original. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
yeah.
Because the original Hunter, they had superpowers.
Right. Yeah.
They were all. I don't know if you guys know the Exalted setting that they
I
do
do.
as well. Yeah. So it was meant to be sort of originally like that. Whereas the Hunter the Vigil then for the new WOD was mortals, just guys, normal average people trying to take down sort of supernaturals, and that's my favorite one, where you don't get to play anything super powered at all.
So the way they actually suggest starting off a Chronicles of Darkness game is there was the World of Darkness flat book, now the Chronicles of Darkness flat book. There's a second edition. They're also confusing because even though we refer to Vampire V5, Requiem and all the Chronicles of Darkness have 2 editions too, but they're just mechanics changes. They're not. So yeah, trying to explain this is like trying to explain early D&D to people. It's nearly impossible. But the way the first book that came out for this reset was actually a little blue and black book that you play a mortal, and the rule set starts with the assumption that you're coming into this most of the time as a human being, and you do not start off as a superpowered whatever. And you transition into whatever other game you're playing. That was the way they wanted it played. It doesn't end up being played that way much, actually, but that was the way it was designed to be played. Hunter the Vigil is just takes that spot book and just does it to the next step and involves like, well, what are humans going to do in this situation once they realize this is going on? And that's it. That's all it really does. And you're right. Hunter the Reckoning, you have faith-based superpowers. Yeah, so it is interesting. Now, it's not the other thing that's interesting about the world is they want to get rid of all this essentialism, and it's not just racial essentialism. Like, there are political philosophies that are biological clans. That makes sense. Like the Bruja are anarchists, but they're also
sworn to sow the seeds of anarchy. Yeah, but they
but
also have the.
Yeah, they're effectively a vampire ethnicity. So it's like what? Like, so what
they separate that out in Requiem, right? So they have the covenants and then the clans, and the covenants are more like a political ideology, and the clan is more like your family of vampires, and they're actually two separate things.
And the other thing it does is in the vampire universe, nobody's clearly a good guy, but and I will defend Masquerade, and it wasn't written to be that way, but in the way it was actually played, there's the good guys, the Camarilla, the bad guys who are actually cooler, the Sabbat, and the real bad guys, I forget the Bali, who kind of show up later in modern stuff.
The devil ones.
Yeah, the actual demonic ones. And there's also demonic ones in the Sabbat, which is confusing too. So this actually realizes the problem with that and isolates different elements of those two major sect groups, the Camarilla and the Sabbat, and separates them out into clear political factions that also can exist in the same city and not always be hostile to each other. So there's no eternal war going on. And so you get 5 base power splats clans, which are much less important in Requiem. They do get developed over time, but when the Requiem really initially comes out, clans barely matter. They're just kind of telling you what your disciplines are. And then you get the 5 political philosophies. Now, in all Chronicles of Darkness games, this is true for all the other splats too. So Werewolf has 5 and 5. Mage has 5 and 5. Promethean, a game that I think is actually cool, but no one really plays because it has no prior analog, 5 and 5.
What the hell is Prophet? Wait! You can't just like drop. What the hell is Promethean? The
Promethean is
Burning?
cool.
What is Promethean Discourse?
You play a golem, basically. You play like a sort of a monster, like an inanimate sort of monster that's trying to become human in some way. And everything around, they have this, oh god, I can't remember the name of it, but basically this effect that affects mortals around them that drives them to hate you. And so you can't stay in the one place for too long. It's a very interesting game. It's very different.
Yeah, so they have, although it's slightly confusing because you would think mommies would be part of that, but mommies have their own game too. Mommy the Cursed. And then there's Geist the Sin Eaters. I'm going back through all the different games that they do.
God, like there's so many, like it's crazy.
Yeah.
Beast. There's Beast as well.
Oh yeah, Beast. Yeah, Beast, which is that's the one that I find hardest to wrap my brain around. But
what's Beast? I've never heard of these obscure games. Beast the Tickling?
No, Beast is like basically every other kind of monster that you can think of. It's primordial monster forms. And so
that's what's really cool about it, because you get to create your own sort of monster and a lair as well that you get to have, like basically your own dungeon that people can come into. So you can enter people's dreams and things. It's very weird.
It's kind of like you could be Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Kind of like,
yeah.
But all these there's consistency between each one of these sub games. But unlike before, they're not written separately. They're not developed separately. Now, what they also do at Requiem is they do have metaplot, but it's vague and minor and always questionable. And early on, this is really, really true. So, for example, there were 2 antagonist factions. Biel's Brood, which is another devil one. And then the 7. I can't tell you what the 7 is, because if you read the book, there's 5 different possible things it could be. They give you 5 different ways to run this antagonist, and it's absolutely not meant for players. And so that changes the dynamics quite a bit. I think one of the reasons I think Requiem had a hard time, though, is that Requiem, of all the new World of Darknesses, keeps more of the naming conventions of the old game. So even some of the clans have the same names, which is confusing because they don't work the same way. They don't do the same things exactly. And
I think that was used as an attempt to onboard players from the old World of Darkness.
But I think it was a mistake.
Yeah, I agree. And it makes it so confusing to talk about as well.
This whole topic is extremely confusing to talk about. But the confusion not only reflects the game development, but I think also reflects like the way that now that the IP is owned by different people and different people make the games, and now both these are not 2 different editions of the same game. They're now literally just 2 different games that are, like, I guess, in market competition with one another now.
Sort of. I mean, so here's where it's unclear. It is unclear that there will be any more Requiem games. There's the last Requiem book that was released was in February 2020. So Requiem had a longer run actually of development than Vampire the Masquerade, which I think people miss. But in 2006 is when things start getting complicated, and this is also one of the issues with Requiem that's really complicated its existence. So 2006, White Wolf gets merges with a European game company. When I say European game company, I mean a video game company. It's allowed relative autonomy, but they really want to push money into like a massive online role player game, which was ended up being a fundamental mistake. Also, Vampire the Requiem, the first book was one of their best sellers, but it never does as well as Masquerade did. Chronicles of Darkness, I think it's probably more loved now than when it was actually released, and that's also kind of a kind of sad problem with it. And at first, they're still doing the book releases like they did in the old Vampire days. Like, the first run, you have a bunch of books come out real fast in 2004. And they're also not sexy. They're just useful. So you have Requiem, then you have Coteries, and you have Nomads, and you have the first Bloodlines book. All right. Now, you will notice that in none of those things, none of them are metaplot driven until you hit the Bloodlines book. Like, so you got 4 whole books released before there's a whole lot of additional metaplot. But they start slowing down production around 2006. So I think they start releasing, because just to put how crazy it was in Masquerade days, they were sometimes releasing, they had like 5 to 6 games, and they were releasing 1 book a month from every game. Like I actually have.
That's wild. That's wild. That's way too much.
Do you think that schedule tires people out though in the end? Do people get burned out with the release schedules? Because when you get so much of something, does it does it end up destroying interest?
That was the problem that they were having. It's not just was the metaplot wrapping everything up. They were also having the problem, and why they did this is sales were flagging dramatically after Second Ed Vampire. So Second Ed Vampire was for edition. I think Third Ed Vampire. Whatever. Revised Ed Vampire. It's hard to know because their naming conventions don't stay the same. They call the current Vampire game Fifth Ed, but Second Ed was not called Second Ed. It was like First Ed Revised, and then there's
the 25th anniversary.
No, that's after.
That's the first edition. Again.
Oh yeah, and then okay, yeah.
Right. So yeah, this is the problem, right? So there's a third release, which
I just have to note here: roleplay game developers are not very good systematic thinkers. It's come on, guys. Just like make things easy. At least the D&D people, like at least once Wizards of the Coast got their hands on it, they like give it nice numbers and it's easy to talk about. But that speaks to the development of the business. Like this is like new territory, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, particularly, that's the other thing I think we have to be somewhat forgiving when we talk about Masquerade. If you encounter Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf the Apocalypse or whatever in the mid 90s as a kid, it is fundamentally different from anything else because it's basically consistent IP that has a very mechanically kind of ingeniously simple role-playing system. You only need 1 dice type. Like you count successes and you go. I mean that does not change. They do clean up a lot of the other mechanics, but that fundamental dice mechanic is consistent to all forms of this product. And that was designed deliberately partly to get women invested in gaming because no one wanted to hang out with math nerds. That was literally the thought process.
But it worked, right? Because World of Darkness was for theater geeks and for all the alternative for the freaks and the those kind of nerds as opposed to the traditional sort of Dungeons and Dragons player, right?
I mean, it's a kind of cultural. It's a cultural paradigm shift, really, because
Mm-hmm.
because it's moving away from the war game origins of Dungeons
Mm-hmm.
and Dragons to like you say, let's dress up and like let's. I mean, it's a storyteller. It's not a dungeon master or like
Yeah.
something that's a big paradigm shift. But I'm wondering. Oh yeah, go ahead, Discourse. Sorry.
But and that's kind of one of the things about Chronicles of Darkness and Vampire the Requiem was that they were trying to hew back to the original intentions of Vampire the Masquerade. I think that over time, because of all this focus on powers and kind of generations, that the game had become much more of a sort of combat oriented, like where
Mm-hmm.
I can influence the world with these special powers, and that's all mechanical. In Chronicles of Darkness, they kind of go, okay, right, that was never the intention. Like we didn't set out to do that originally. Let's go back to the drawing board and go back to where it was, where it's meant to be just storytelling and dealing with emotional issues.
Mm-hmm.
In Vampires the Requiem, you have your sort of touchstones and things like that, things that keep you human, and you have to, you're meant to be role playing out your kind of, like as Varn said, your transition from mortal into vampire and all that entails. And that's kind of, it's more like a low level sort of story, but it's one that is more emotional, and it is one that's more about role play at the table as opposed to just simply trying to kind of interact with the world in a combat style.
I think that's a really important observation because a lot of people uh, think that they want to play with powerful characters in a game, but they find that they find that not interesting at the end of the day. That's why nobody plays like level 20 characters in Dungeons and Dragons.
Mhm.
Everybody wants to play like level 1 to 5 because I think you mentioned it at the beginning, Discourse. It's 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 like more horror. There's more
Mhm.
horror and mystery and intrigue and excitement when you don't know what's going on, that danger for your character is real. Your character can get killed and things like that, and that makes the game just more exciting and more story driven. I think that the part about when I played Vampire the Masquerade, there was definitely a shift in the culture from like doing intrigue to like there's a combat every week. It's
Mhm.
like roll what is it, wits and alertness. Like the GM would just go, wits and alertness, everybody. It's like, oh my god, what's happening now? And it would turn out, and it's not really a great game for combat because at least Dungeons and Dragons is like grid based. Fifth
Yeah.
edition, you can play quite like you can play as a quasi war game. I've played.
Mhm.
I've got all my like Warhammer minute.
That's the best way to
Scenery
play
out.
D&D.
It's the best.
Yeah.
It's the best way. But Vampire, like trying to do combat, it's like where am I? It's go
It's
ahead,
got to be
Discourse.
theater of the mind. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be theater of the man or dressed up or dressed up as a vampire and talking to each other. But yeah, I think like there's like a very logical, like you said, like a logical reason for Requiem taking the direction that it did. But what I wanted to ask you, Discourse, specifically is, like I guess we're all broadly within the millennial range, but I think there's like the old millennials like Varn and I and the young millennials like you. And there is a big divide around 2000, I would say, in gaming culture. It's not that computer games hadn't been important before and things like that, but I think there's a kind of big, like a kind of cultural shift in the 2000s. And we talked about like everybody bitching and moaning about, like changing editions and stuff like that. But do you think there was something in the cultural zeitgeist at the time that just meant that there was like less interest in playing like vampires? Like that was kind of like something that was tired, like because I'm in two minds about it because there was the whole like Twilight stuff and
Yeah.
That's later
True.
though.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts? Like, are there like external reasons why like Vampire the Requiem just didn't take off? Like, it didn't touch on something.
Well, I mean, like for myself, I never got into vampire until I would say after probably 2010. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever I was getting into it, it was around the time of like Twilight and things like that. But I would say that like any talk of vampire back then was tarred with the idea of Twilight. Like you could not mention the word vampire without having Twilight jokes made at all. You know, I don't know. I actually don't know what vampires were like really in a pre-Twilight world. I think I was a little bit too young to really quite appreciate them, aside from watching like Bram Stoker's Dracula, right, or Interview with a Vampire, I suppose.
Interview with a Vampire is what vampires were before Twilight.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Yeah. See, and I mean, I don't. For me, myself personally, I don't think that it didn't make me think less of vampires or anything like that. It didn't make me think they were lame because I wasn't really interested in Twilight and like whatever, you know, it was just kind of a joke. Then maybe they did lose a little bit of their edge, a little bit of their teeth, you know, in those years. For 2006, honestly, I have no idea. Like in 2006, I was still just getting into Warhammer, so I had no idea about about vampire. It was all like at that stage, I had no idea about it.
So I do think, you know, I actually think I have a pretty good theory because there was a backlash against vampires in the late 90s into, and it got even worse after 9/11. But there was, if you like look at films, for example, like monster horror films, you have a shift in the mid to late 90s from vampires to zombies. One is you have a general movement away from gothic horror into more visceral horror, torture porn, that sort of thing, and this is not that either. Two, I mean, the Underworld series literally stole many elements straight out of Vampire the Masquerade,
Yep.
and that was, and so between that and Blade, the superheroization of vampires was total. I mean, you know, the one of the concept artists for Blade is literally the main artist for Vampire the Masquerade's early art.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
they didn't
like,
credit, and they didn't credit him at first. Like they just stole his artwork, stole his aesthetic, and then they, like, I think for the second movie they were like, yeah, sorry, we didn't pay you. How about we pay you this time?
Wow. Okay.
So it had been injected into the culture as part of comic book culture, but we hadn't had the comic book movieization. And frankly, also 9/11 happened and scary stuff. Like, I do think there's a real sense that the gothic horror stuff was dying anyway, but that finishes it off. You don't have gothic horror movies really after 2001 until the late aughts. And when vampires come back, they come back almost with the idea of like the world of vampires, like the Vampire Diaries, whatever, is the idea of vampire as a metaphor for teenage sexuality problems, and that seems to come out explicitly in American culture of the 10 years where, like, well, you had a whole bunch of nerds learning how to talk to women poorly playing Vampire the Masquerade. Like,
so are you saying that that's where True Blood came from then?
Yeah, I do. I think that as well. I mean,
True Blood is another Vampire the Masquerade ripoff. Like,
yeah, it is. It is. I would not be surprised if I was to discover, because like the ancient generation vampire stuff, I mean, that also goes back to Anne Rice. But if I was to discover that, like, the author was a vampire player, because the way that works very much feels like when I watched the show I think it was in 2009, or 2010, because I was abroad. I was like, this totally rips this off, but people don't know it because this has been out of this niche nerd culture was effectively dead at that point.
Did you enjoy True Blood? I mean, but it was a different tone, wasn't it? It was like funny, like vampires are funny. Like they had
the first season. I think True Blood's one of these things that the first season is very different from the later seasons. So.
It was a drama, right? It was more like a CW show almost back then.
Right.
It was like Smallville or something, where you get to know all the vampires and find out about their lives and root for them.
Right. There was the weird Jaguars. I just remember they had the weird Jaguars who were like rednecks on meth. It was like, what the hell? It was crazy.
That's like a Vampire the Masquerade game.
Yeah,
Like,
no, that
it
is
a
like
lot like a Vampire Masquerade game.
I have to say, yeah, it's like True Blood is really what, like, like Interview with a Vampire is what, like, Vampire the Masquerade players like believe that they're playing. True
Yeah.
Blood is like what they're actually playing. Yeah, that's it's like, oh no, who's Suki gonna soak up with this week? Is it gonna be the Viking guy? It's like we got to go take down the meth dealing weird jaguars. It's like, come on, that's
pure. That is
that's
pure Vampire the Masquerade. I think the other thing that I will say with Requiem, Vampire Masquerade could never figure out what age group it was actually aimed at. Like, it was ostensibly aimed at adults, but not really. Like, it was really aimed at older teens. When they tried to be more adult, it got more violent and booby-y. Like, that was what they meant by adult. It wasn't more adult. The exception to that, I think, is actually what you played through Discourse, and that's the Giovanni Chronicles. That is the actually mature, and it's not that mature. Like,
I
Requiem
hated
is
the
an
Giovanni
adult.
Chronicles, by the way. I hated
Yeah,
it.
it's not great.
It's
Why
not
did-
a good.
Why did you hate the Giovanni Chronicles?
Well, firstly, it was kind of sold to me as like the big game, right? Like the big Vampire the Masquerade. Like, this is the sort of, the way. Oh God, like, I'm trying to think now of some other. It's like the iconic sort of like game for Vampire the Masquerade.
Giovanni
kinda
Chronicles and Transylvania Chronicles was sold as
Yeah.
the way to play the game.
Right.
Yeah, and you start off like, see, you basically, it walks you through the history of the Giovanni and the sort of the rise of like the Camarilla, I think it is. So you get to see it from the very beginning, and you're like sired into a vampire, and then it goes on from there, and you come back to the same characters at different time periods throughout history, and it's basically a game where your agency doesn't matter. You get to make no decisions whatsoever, because ultimately at the end of the day, you're playing a historical game where there has to be these things that happen because they're important to the meta plot, and it represents everything that is wrong, I think, with the original Vampire the Masquerade, or at least the thing that I don't enjoy about it.
Yeah, like the fact that it ends up, unless you've got a radical GM storyteller who is willing to just use the meta plot for inspiration and really invent something, you're going to get railroaded to a load of bullshit. And that's the problem with, I think, role play games in general that try and do too much world building.
But that's the thing, right? Like, that's what's so glorious about it, because if you're gonna play Vampire the Masquerade and then you're gonna like make all these radical changes to the meta plot and start fooling around with it and really trying to like get the mechanics and stuff like that to work, why aren't you just playing Vampire the Requiem then? Because that's that is what Vampire the Requiem is. It is a toolkit.
So I kind of have a last question for us to wrap up. So we've got like a 5th edition. There's Chronicles of Darkness.
World of Darkness 5th edition. Yeah.
And, so we've got. Do you think Vampire is going to come back? Do you think that the day of Vampire is gone? Are they? Do you think, why, if we want to play horror, why not play, like you suggested, a Discourse, Call of Cthulhu, which is like still seems to be going strong.
Firstly, World of Darkness never went away. It's always been there. I've been playing it for the last 12 years. It's still kind of around. And I really like it. But it's a much different type of horror from like Call of Cthulhu, right? Like, Call of Cthulhu has the mythos and the Lovecraftian sort of elements, and Vampire doesn't really deal in that as much. There are elements of it there, like even Chronicles of Darkness has it with the God Machine and things like that. So, but I think they're definitely, I mean, so long as there are edgy teenagers, there will always be a place for vampires, I think, in society. So long as there are sad teenagers who want to write poetry, there will always be a place for that sort of gothic kind of horror, for sure. But
so long as they grow up into edgy 40-year-olds who also write poetry.
Yes. But the thing is, right, I mean, you've got to remember that at one stage, World of Darkness was more popular than Dungeons and Dragons as far as role-playing games go. Like in the 90s.
A lot more popular.
Yeah. Like
significantly more popular.
World of Darkness was the role-playing game. It wasn't Dungeons and Dragons for a long time there. I don't see them ever quite grab. Like Lord of the Rings is just such a good series of movies. There's never going to be. I don't like. I guess I suppose over time our cultural touchstone is changing. Now I'm getting old. I'm like Lord of the Rings. The kids are like the Marvel movies. But I think I don't know. I think the vampires still have a place inside. I think they have survived the transition through from like Twilight pretty well. I think they're sort of being rehabilitated a little bit now because there was a long time there where they were kind of lame, and I think we're kind of getting over that.
The lameness. Varn, final word?
Yeah, I think, one, the despite the fact that they were releasing massive books when I say massive, like 500-page books in print on demand form, which literally disintegrate pretty much when you touch them. There's still been a market for this, and so much so that various companies have brought back Vampire 5th Edition. The problem that Vampire 5th Edition has isn't that people aren't culturally ready for it. It's that it's had scandal after problem in its release, and it's the company, like, if you thought the complicatedness of the companies releasing Chronicles of Darkness or even Old White Wolf was complicated, there's been 5 different companies associated with the Vampire 5th Ed, including some like Onyx Path, Renegade, Mordifius. I can like it's insane. I think one thing that does have a problem that we do have a problem with now, and I don't necessarily think this is all bad, but it is different. Vampire has always tried to incorporate current events into its metafiction, which is another thing Requiem totally gets away from. Moving Vampire 5th Ed back, and they try to do that. That does not go over well, and it doesn't really work. Like, it's when almost inevitably when they try to do that, they get accused of something. So for example, they tried to include Chechnya stuff, and
that was the big one,
and it did not go well.
It's pretty grim. I mean, like, like, we have to be real here. Like, I'm known as being a little bit critical of the wokey sensitive stuff, but like, it's a little bit weird to be trying to like do something about people getting murdered for being gay in Chechnya, and like that's kind of a bit offensive, or not offensive, just bad taste.
It's a problem you have though with the meta. Like, how do you get around that? Because you're creating an alternative today, and if you're going to talk about like vampires running society, and it's meant to ostensibly be a mirror of today's events, then you've got to explain it in the sense that there are all these conspiracies. So how does something like that happen?
Yeah, right? They ran into that before with 9/11 is actually. Vampire the Masquerade was still existent in 2001, 2002, 2003. And in fact, the Time of Judgment comes out of that, right? Which is the Apocalypse metaplots. But one of the things you'll find interesting in those games is they seem to pretend 9/11 did not happen.
Well, this is but what is interesting, I think we kind of accidentally stumbled on something as a kind of concluding thought, at least like in the 90s and 2000s, people were able to tolerate that kind of, alternative world using political events for like storytelling purposes. But today, Anton Yeager has written about this, Alex Hukuli has written about this. There's like a kind of hyperpolitics that takes place where everything is turned into politics, because your consumption is your politics. That's why people are like, when the Ukraine war broke out, that's why people were like, well, I don't want to listen to Russian music, because like what you consume is almost seen as an endorsement to such a level that we get to that level. So nowadays we like, I'm not making a judgment about this. I'm just saying we can't just make a separation between like the real world of politics and our like private consumption of something. our private consumption of something is coming to define who we are in a way. That's why you get all this outrage about like TV shows and things like that, because you know like you can enjoy, like I don't know if this is a generational thing or because of the culture. Like I can enjoy Con Air, which is an awesome movie, even though I know that movie is like a reactionary movie, like it's like a very like conservative part. But like today, do we have that same ability to distinguish between like our private, like what we enjoy, and what is acceptable? How do we strike that balance?
I
Discourse?
think. Go ahead.
Discourse was going to jump in. Go on.
Well, I was going to say that, people today, I mean, even non-conservatives enjoy The Dark Knight, for example, and that's an incredibly conservative movie with an incredibly conservative message behind it. But, people can still enjoy that. I mean, one of the things, the Chechnya thing, I think, could have been handled with a lot more sensitivity. I think for sure. I think that was a feel. I mean, I think that obviously, like these problems will crop up when you're trying to do a meta plot that is based upon real world events that are actually occurring and people are actually being impacted by. But there's definitely, I think that specific moment, the one that kind of that was really big, that could have been handled a lot better by the original. I think was it Onyx Path originally did it, and then Paradox took over. That's all.
So it's White Wolf, then Onyx Path is kind of a rump core of some of the original White Wolf writers who own their own stuff. But this was actually White Wolf as owned by Mordifius, or maybe not Mordifius, another European company that did this. And then White Wolf is dissolved immediately upon this happening. Kind of botching the release of all this, and now there's several different companies that own part of it, including Onyx Path, who's produced material. One of the issues with Fifth Ed is it's not produced by one company. They've farmed out different books to different companies. One thing that I want to push back on, I think I've read Yeager's and Hochili's piece, but I like to remind people that we were dumping French Rhine down the sewer in 2000. And in fact, in a way that was bigger than even what happened with Russia.
You were dumping French wine and eating freedom fries. We weren't.
So let me point out to you what your two friends share, that they're not Americans. This is part of American culture for way longer than the last 20 years. So that doesn't really explain what happened here. We've been politicizing everything since the 70s. Like, that's also why Harry Potter was satanic before it was transphobic. And and in our culture wars, both sides have always done this too. Like, so in fact, evangelical Christians kind of perfected it 40 years before progressives did.
Oh geez.
So yeah, I mean, like, canceling things and book burnings is the OG evangelical reaction to stuff. So it's when I hear these things from Europeans, I'm always like, yeah, this is not new here. It's not. And White Wolf comes from here.
Well, thanks for exporting it to Europe. Very appreciative.
You did it on your own. I didn't do it. You did it. Whatever. You got.
Okay.
All right. Whatever.
There we go.
It's just Twitter. It's just Twitter. I never noticed any of it until I joined Twitter, and I was like, oh right, huh? I was okay. This is where these conversations are all happening.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah,
that's the difference. Is these conversations happened in America in the 90s, but unless it was like being pissed off at the French because they didn't support the Iraq War or something, it would happen and die. It would happen for like 2 weeks and then go away. And now it doesn't go away. That's the difference. It's not. Maybe that's where the hyperpolitics comes from. But I think it was a problem for White Wolf going back to, though, because like I said, it is a weird, ominous thing when we're talking about world events, but 9/11 doesn't happen. It really is strange. And I think that's going to be true with any meta plot, and that's increasingly why even comic books don't really address it anymore. You will notice that Marvel Comics, for example, not just the MCU but Marvel Comics in general, used to have specific historical references in their stuff. Now they have a house mission not to do that.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, that gloomy note, it has been a pleasure, and I'm super excited to releasing this. Thank you for joining the team Discourse, and it's always lovely to see you, Varn. Anything to plug before we sign out?
Well, thank
Varn?
you for having me.
Go.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm gonna jump in on. I'm gonna plug my stuff first, Varn. I'm gonna steal your spot. Discourse Miniatures at YouTube. I have a YouTube channel basically running over mostly it's miniatures content, miniature wargaming, and things like that.
Varn?
I have some interviews coming up with Daniel Tutt. I have some cultural stuff coming out where Jason Miles and I talk about 90s music and defend new metal for other things that people don't like people defending. So Jason makes the case that the first backlash against new metal was actually explicitly racist. So it's should be interesting. I think people will enjoy that. I have interviews coming out on Christopher Lash, on world systems theory, on China, on a lot of stuff because I released too much. And I guess I can announce on this show. It looks like right now I will be at a live show with people in October in LA. It's not 100% certain and pinned down, but we're looking at that. So if you want to meet me, come out. And what is that date? I think it's the last week of October in LA.
To be reflected. So if you want your parasocial relationship with Varn consummated, come to LA. Yeah,
me and
I like
Jason.
it when he yells at me. That's when I feel I've got our true connection.
Come yell at me in person. You know,
Yeah.
we should set you an OnlyFans up where you just like people like pay you to yell at them for 40 minutes. It's like,
that actually is a thing. I did not realize until very recently that there are literally people. It's called financial domination.
Yeah, that exists. Yeah.
Jeez. All right. Well, on the note of financial domination, as we say, This is Revolution. We are out.